Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm the host, Robert Bryce. This podcast is where we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And my guest today is Daniel Yergin, who has a new book out. It's called The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Thanks for being with us, Dan.
Thank you. Glad to join you, Robert.
So our tradition, you've had a long career in as an analyst, as an author. I could introduce you, but I'm at the point in my career where I'm tired of windy introductions. So my policy is to have people introduce themselves. So if you don't mind, imagine you just arrived at a dinner party, you don't know anyone there, and you're introducing yourself. Go.
Well, thank you. If I was at that dinner party, hi, I'm Dan Yergin. Glad to be here. And Robert, glad to be with you. I'm the author, as you point out, of that new book called The New Map. It's, in a sense, a trilogy almost of books that I've done. The first, big energy book I did, although I'd done books before that, was The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power. And then I did The Quest, and now it's The New Map. And it really tries to map out how our energy world is changing. I'm vice chairman of IHSMarkit, which is a research organization company with about 16,000 people around the world, focused on understanding markets and everything that happens around markets.
Great. And I'll just add, you're also a winner of the Pulitzer Prize. This is your fourth book that you've authored by yourself, and you're co-author, I believe, of 4 other books. Is that right?
Right, yes.
So
my first book was actually a book called Shattered Peace, which was on the origins of the Cold War. And as I've been writing The New Map, I was thinking I never thought I'd write another book about origins of new Cold Wars, but that's what we're seeing with China and Russia today, and that's part of the new map.
Well, that touches on what I wanted to, the first question I have here is, so why did you write this book? What prompted you? Was there a certain moment, or you'd been thinking about this for a long time? Why now, and why this subject?
Well, I was thinking about how the world has changed. In different eras, the world looks differently, and literally did think about it as a new map. It started thinking about how the new map of energy that was deriving from the shale revolution in the United States, how that was changing trading patterns, it was changing the movement of energy across the United States globally. And then that expanded into the other maps. I have a section called China's Map, which looks at really China as it is in its new phase in terms of South China Sea and Belt and Road, and this kind of growing concerning clash between the US and China. Russia's map, clearly Putin doesn't like the phrase energy superpower, but that's been the source of Russia being a superpower since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then the Middle East map, of course, which is complicated and yet goes back to a map that was drawn in 2016. And then the roadmap to the future.
1916, the Pico-Sykes map, right?
Yeah, I just said 2016, I meant 1916. That's right, Sykes-Picot.
And can you move your mic just a hair closer there, Dan? I don't mind seeing it if it's in the frame, but just so we get your audio just up just a bit. So how long did it take you to write this book?
I think it's altogether over 4 years. You always start off thinking you'll write a book. Well, this one I'll be able to do more quickly because I know all the material. And then you start researching, as you know, Robert, and you go down so many paths. So this was more than a 4-year project, and a lot has changed over those 4 years.
Well, and you were able to keep it pretty well up to date. It's out September 15th, and but yet you have sections on COVID and the coronavirus, so you were able to add up to it right close to the publication date. That was
indeed. I have China's taking control over Hong Kong, so. As you know, you finish a book, Robert, normally many months before publication. I would say I probably irritated my publisher a little bit, but I just kept working on it.
That's what you're supposed to do.
You don't finish a book, they take it away from you, and they took it away from me in early July. And so the book is up to date through then. Sure. They just said, you've got to stop.
Yeah. Well, and the market is always, changing. And so I'll ask you a little bit about some of those things, but, one of the things.
I think, Robert, what I did do, the book, I really did continue to revise through COVID. And what I was trying to do, and I think I did it, was capture the curve, the change that's happened in all of our lives because of COVID.
Yeah, and I was pleased to see that because it really has upended well, all of the markets around the world for pretty much everything, but particularly hit the oil and gas sector very hard because they were both in oversupply. There was an oversupply of hydrocarbons, and then demand went away. So that was an unusual in the history, as I see it, in oil and gas, where there have been oversupplies, but the demand had been strong, or you'd had a demand fall off, but not both at the same time. So it was especially impactful, right?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, you could say even go beyond unusual, say unprecedented, because there'd never been a government mandated shutdowns of the world economy, which we saw. And I described it in the new map. I call it an economic dark age that descended over North America and Europe in the spring of 2020, and that took demand down in a way that was in nobody's strategic plan. Nobody's.
Yeah, I mean, how would the airlines ever plan for that, right? Oh, by the way, you're not going to have any passengers, and or you might have a few, and that'll only be a few. But we'll come back to that. But I want to commend you because I finished the book. I've been working my way through it, and I finished it this morning. And I love maps. I've always loved maps. I have maps in my old fashioned. My kids use Google all the time. I use paper maps. I always have enjoyed paper maps. But what to me was one of the big takeaways, and of course the theme of the book is about maps, but in particular, you drive home the point in several sections about the importance of how pipelines are affecting the maps, right? And that the geopolitics is now being defined in large part around the maps that are showing the pipelines. And so you called the crises over gas. In one of the first few chapters, you write about Russia cutting off gas to Ukraine. And I found that to be particularly important because it shows how Russia is using gas as a geopolitical weapon. But then you talk about the Nord Stream pipeline, Nord Stream 2, and how critical those pipelines are to Germany and Russia. Can you talk about that relationship, not just Germany and Russia, but moreover how gas politics and Russia's control of gas is a key part of their relationship with Europe and America's contest for influence over Europe with Russia?
Right. Well, first of all, Robert, let me say, like you, I'm fascinated by maps. I mean, I don't want people to think this is not the National Geographic. Maps, in many senses, is a metaphoric term here. But I had this section, I had to cut it out because of space, writing about, I'm sure you remember when you used to go into a gasoline station, there would be all the maps of the region and the national maps and CUSA and a Chevrolet and, and all that era of those kind of paper maps that people use for trips is gone the way of,
and you could get a state map, you could get a national map, you could get a regional map, and sometimes you get them for free. They would be branded with Gulf or Texaco or whatever.
Exactly, and the maps were right next to the peanut machines and the M&M machines for or you get bubble gum. That's right, for 5 cents. So those that era is gone. But boy, it used to be a whole range of maps. So now it's all electronic. But to go to your question. Pipelines have really become a focus of politics, of energy. It's true in the United States, and it's certainly true in Europe. And I write in the new map about the issues around Russian pipelines to Europe, which have been contentious going back to the late 1950s and early 1960s. And the clash we see now over Nord Stream 2, which is the big gas pipeline that would parallel an existing pipeline under the Baltic Sea from Russia to Germany, avoiding Ukraine, is a great source of controversy. And the US is seeking to put sanctions and has put sanctions on it, saying it's a geopolitical threat to the United States. The Germans bridle at that, and they bridle at the sanctions, although that may be changing now because of the poisoning of Navalny, the Russian opposition figure who was poisoned in Russia, is now, at least as we're speaking, is in Germany in an induced coma, and that may actually change the politics around it. But this was a pipeline that was just weeks away from being finished, an $11 billion pipeline. But the opposition, bipartisan opposition in the United States has been great. Germans scratching their heads saying, why are you telling us what pipelines to build? But it's a real sore point, not only in US-Russian relations, but in US-German relations. Although, as I say, it's now become more complicated.
Well, and the Russians have they shut off the gas to Ukraine. That was 2009, was it?
Well, 2006, then 2009.
Okay,
The
right.
Europeans responded by making their gas system much more flexible and turning creating the ability to take in LNG. And I have one map in the book that just shows all the liquefied natural gas receiving terminals in Europe. So the Europeans have flexibility in their system and are, so that I think that it sounds strange to say, but it's made the pipelines, the supplies from Russia, less political because the Europeans can say, okay, we can go somewhere else. And,
And that's interesting,
maybe
especially
an unintended consequence for the Russians.
Well, I think it's particularly true with Poland, right? And that the Poles established their own LNG import facility because they have a lot of history with Russia, and nearly all of it's bad, right? And they did not want to rely on the Russians for gas, and so they signed a long-term contract with, I think it was with Cheniere, for LNG import, so that they had a wedge. I mean, Poland's still very heavily dependent on coal, but they used what were the that's my view. How do you view the Poland situation with regard to LNG?
Lithuania, some of the other countries have definitely wanted to pivot, and just have that capacity to say, and I think the Lithuanian energy minister said once they created the LNG receiving terminal, somehow the price of Russian gas went down just by coincidence. So
just by coincidence, yeah.
As a buyer, you want alternatives, and I think they're there now. But Poland has been a big opponent of the Nord Stream 2, because also they have a gas pipeline that does run through Poland, and they collect revenues, transit revenues from that. So this is, when Nord Stream 1 was built, it was controversial, but not very controversial. But so much has changed now in Russia's relationship with Europe and with the United States.
Well, and it's also changed with China. And again, that relationship has been, I mean, they were in a shooting war, now 40, 50 years ago, roughly. And now the Power of Siberia pipeline, which you write about as well, and I've followed because I just find this is the very definition of a mega project, right? A 5,000-mile long pipeline, over 30-year deal for $400 billion worth of natural gas moving from Russia to China. Is this a new era then in terms of that relationship, or well, let me ask it more plainly. How does that pipeline then going to change U.S. Russia China relations? Right, there's three different players here that are all interconnected.
People don't see at the time. So one of the things I write about in the new map is at the same time that we were putting sanctions onto and trying to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping had this kind of fancy television hookup where they opened the new pipeline between two countries, and it kind of signified that growing relationship between Russia and China. And I think that's a very significant geopolitical fact, and energy is part of that.
But it's also partly because the length of the contract, right? 30 years is a very long time, and it's the pipelines are different from LNG in that it's not just a fact on the ground. It's a very large and expensive piece of infrastructure that's going to connect them now for decades. You made it really. Go ahead.
It's a new reality that now exists. Robert, are you picking up the other sound from my wife at the refrigerator?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, good. To pick up, it's a new reality in terms of that relationship between Putin and Xi and Russia and China. And I had the opportunity to observe it at St. Petersburg conference a year and a half ago, a little less than a year and a half ago. And you could just see they kind of describe each other as their best friends. And I think they're united both by the nature of their political systems, but they're also united in their opposition to what they see as a dominating role of the United States in global affairs. And they're both, that has brought them together, and their economies are getting more and more connected.
Well, you had a great line in here. You said regarding Russia and China that it was a relationship once based on Marx and Lenin is now grounded in oil and gas. Right. That it clearly seems to be the case, but it's not just Russia and China. Let's shift to Egypt and Israel. They were just, 5 decades again, were shooting at each other. And then in the end of last year, they signed a $19.5 billion gas supply contract that's now, so the Israelis are supplying the Egyptians with gas. And then you point out that some of that's going to be then put into LNG terminals for export by the Egyptians. It's another
Right.
example of how gas politics are changing geopolitics, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, for decades, the Israelis really worried about their dependence on imported energy. They used a lot of coal, they imported oil. And then these discoveries were made off the coast of Israel, which people thought was a Dead Sea in terms of resources. Now it's become a very hot area for energy development. And last year, it was remarkable. We had the Egyptian and the Israeli energy ministers come together at our conference in Houston, together on the platform, talking about their energy collaboration. And there's now discussion about a pipeline. Speaking of pipelines, from Israel and Cyprus that would go through Greek waters onto Europe. And to think that Israel is now going to be an energy exporter is something 5 years ago would not have been expected. So there's a new geopolitical reality there. And what it's also highlighted is Turkey's ambitions. Turkey is really a rival both to Saudi Arabia and to Iran for influence in the Middle East. And Turkey is basically trying to block some of this development and claim the waters through which this pipeline would pass as its own. So that's another example of a geopolitical conflict that involves pipelines.
Well, and the Israelis are now supplying gas to Jordan. And then there was a short news item that they were even talking about supplying gas into Gaza, into the Gaza City power plant. Now, that hasn't happened because Gaza, being Gaza, there's still a lot of conflict around that. But
they do provide gas to the Palestinian
right.
Authority as well through a third party. But they do that. And so, who would have expected that?
Well, and it is remarkable looking at the Israelis' history, right? Because during the apartheid era, they were buying oil from South Africa, right? It was oil that was produced via the Fischer-Tropsch process from coal, right? And Israel, like South Africa, was isolated from, in terms of energy trade, heavily dependent on coal. But now
the other thing that before the fall of the Shah of Iran, they were buying significant amount of oil from Iran, but that's when they had a kind of quasi relationship with Iran. But of course, that ended with the Iranian Revolution, and Iran now, implacably opposed to Israel. So they really had to scrounge around. For a time. They controlled oil fields in the Sinai, but they gave the Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace deal. And so they felt very vulnerable. But now, they've discovered these resources. And it was, as often happens, people said, no, there's no resource there. Why are you wasting your time? And you have a few stubborn people who say, we're not going to give up. And lo and behold, you find these resources. And now it's, the Eastern Med, as they call it, is a very hot area for energy development.
Well, and wasn't that was the long time joke about Israel? Well, if this is the promised land, how come there wasn't any oil here? Well,
right, that's right. Or that Moses, they turned left as they came out of Egypt when they should have gone right towards the Arabian Peninsula.
But you mentioned the Eastern Mediterranean, and that Leviathan field, and there's another field there offshore Israel. I'm not remember Tamar and Leviathan are the two big gas fields there. Those were discovered by Noble, right? It was an American company that was really the key player there. So let's fast forward. I don't think this is in your book, but Chevron just acquired Noble. So does that change the politics now of the possibility of building the Eastern Mediterranean pipeline? Because that's a big acquisition and puts Chevron right in the middle of some of those Eastern Mediterranean politics.
Well, Chevron is obviously accustomed in dealing in what we call complicated parts of the world. And they've certainly entered into a new complicated part of the world. That acquisition also brought them some very significant resources in the United States. But I think what it does do is you have a really heavy-duty company that has a strong balance sheet and a ability. After all, they're the ones who really developed Kazakh, turned Kazakh into a world oil power in partnership with the Kazakhs. So I think that they're a company that gets big projects done. And this is a big project.
So what about those politics then? Because this is another example of the contested waters, and I want to come back to talking about what's going on in China with regard to the 9-dash map and so on. But is that you said Turkey is opposed and Cyprus kind of stands in the middle? Any forecasts on how this works out, and to what will that gas, because that gas is going to compete with Russian gas into the European market, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the key word that you just said, which is competition, and they will be competing, and they'll have to make the economics work and get the right partners. And so, I think they're committed. This group of countries working together and companies to do it, and it would be in a sense another form of diversification for Europe. I think that the issues with Turkey go beyond this. As I said, Turkey's competition for leadership in the Middle East, its difficult relationship now with the United States, and here you have Turkey and Greece, which are both members of NATO. I think that's a situation you should watch very carefully, that it may be something that's not much, front page or front of the news now, but could come to loom larger.
Sure. So just in moving on then to the maps of the Middle East, one of the other sections in the book, you talk about you have a chapter called The Struggle for Iraq. And I've been following the Iraqi situation with regard to electricity because I went to Lebanon and have seen the issues of electricity supply in Iraq are similar to that of Lebanon, a tattered grid where a lot of small generators. But Iraq just synchronized in the last few weeks, synchronized their electric grid with the grid in Iran. And the Trump administration is pressuring the Iraqis to move away from Iran. But I guess the short question is, Dan, after the United States waged 2 wars in Iraq, who's winning the struggle for Iraq?
Well, I think it's there's no doubt that Iranian influence, dominance, penetration of Iraq is quite considerable. It was its objective to do that. It saw Saddam Hussein as its great enemy, but the U.S. is a player there too. I think that it's hard to believe it's how many years? It's 17 years really since the invasion of Iraq, and the country is still trying to get back on footing. And it also is highly dependent upon oil for 95% of government revenues. So when oil price collapses, Iraq is really in big trouble. I think the point you go to about electricity, they do depend in southern Iraq for electricity from Iran, and that's just the way the grid is set up. And until there's an alternative, they don't have an alternative. And sort of saying, so there's been this kind of negotiation and friction and trying to get Iraq to, put, the sanctions on Iran and so forth in terms of imports. But, Iraq is not going to function without at least getting some of its electricity from Iran. That's just a reality.
They're buying natural gas as well, right? Isn't there a gas pipeline that's cross-border there as well? So I'll ask the question this way: Does the fragmented and weak Iraq serve Iran's political goals like a weak and fragmented Lebanon serves Iran's political goals? I mean, is that really just to keep them weak?
I think that's right. They don't want to see a strong, united Iraq. They want to maintain their influence. And what is interesting is over the last year, you've seen, or year and a half now, I think I wrote about when this started. Yeah, I wrote about in the new map, protests against Iranian influence and protests in Shia regions of Iraq, including the burning of Iraqi consulate and so forth. So, it's not like everybody wants to get on board with Iran. There's certainly opposition to it, but all the indications is that Iran has penetrated Iraqi society a lot. And, in the initial days of ISIS at the beginning, what you saw was some Iraqis sort of more open to ISIS until they saw what it really was, because they saw it as resisting what they called the Persians, which is the what you often hear in that part of the world when people talk about Iran, because they see it as part of the sort of Persian imperialism.
And so, this maybe you didn't address this in the book, and understand you're walking kind of a delicate line here. But in retrospect, these ideas of America's efforts to destabilize or remove Saddam Hussein, in fact, may have made it. Did they make did they increase instability in the Middle East? I guess ultimately
Right.
By waging two different wars.
I think it probably would have stayed unstable with Saddam Hussein there. But, I read the 4-volume U.S. Army history of the Iraq War, and a lot of it is, about mistakes that were made, the failure to plan, to really think through what a post-war Iraq would be, not recognizing the Sunni Shia eruption and tension that would emerge, the question about de-Baathification. Was it a mistake to, just send the Iraqi army home without any financial resources? What they did to the officer corps, and this is going to be something that we're going to wrestle with for a long time. But that 4-volume U.S. Army history was very interesting in terms of, the kind of shock among the U.S. military itself when the Iraqi army was disbanded and sent home, rather than maintaining it as a unit. Now, the other side was, if they had maintained it, it would have been seen as Sunni domination of Shia, which is the argument. But I think, that is, there's a subject there for a really very important history that would really address these questions. What was the consequence and what was the cost? And what's going to be the lasting impact?
Well, and it seems the lasting impact is just this fragile Iraqi society where the civil society just doesn't work. The electric grid doesn't work. That this fragmentation and corruption is which I guess, could you have predicted that? We don't know. But let me move on and talk about the Spratlys, because you have the China's map, which I found really interesting. And I've heard about the Spratly Islands and the South China Sea, but it wasn't until I read your chapters on this that I really grasped the importance of why this area is so ripe for armed conflict or accidental conflict. But you said, I like this line from the book. You said, a single cartographic combatant. I like that line. A single cartographic combatant led the charge. Bai Meichu, one of China's most influential and respected geographers. He made 2 maps in the 1930s that are still helping define China's politics today. Can you explain those?
Yeah, it was so interesting, and this was so fascinating to research this and learn about it, because I started off with the question, where did the 9-dash line map come from, which is the map to China, and I have that in the book. I used the official Chinese map that they submitted to a tribunal in The Hague. It shows China basically owning the South China Sea. And so the question, I think, Robert, when you're writing a book, you start to just become obsessed with something, and you go down that, you keep going down it. And so, it took me back to the beginning of the 1930s, when the French Indochina, because Vietnam was part of France's empire, was fraying, it was falling apart, it was the early Depression. And there was a great fear of Japanese penetration into the region. And the French regarded the South China Sea, they had Vietnamese claims that they said went back to the beginning of the 19th century. So they sent this commander out with a couple of ships to go to the different islands and to sort of put up a flag and put a thing indicating it was France, and blow a bugle and say, this is part of France now. And news did not travel fast in the early 1930s, but when word reached China, this set off, great upset. This is because they said, well, wait, these are historically our territorial waters. This is where our fishermen go. And so Bai Meichu, who you mentioned, was a cartographer who said, geography is in the source of, patriotism. And so he, as you said, led the charge, did these maps that showed that the South China Sea belonged to China. And then after World War II, the nationalist Chinese adopted it, in schools and everything like that. And then they went to Taiwan, the remnants of nationalist China, and the Chinese came to power in 1949, and they adopted that map. But it only kind of really became a big issue, in the last 10 or 15 years. And China has taken islands, has added 3,200 acres of new land by dredging.
In the Spratlys.
Yeah, in the Spratlys, and the Paracels, and turned them into basically military bases.
Right.
And the U.S. premise is freedom of the seas. This doesn't belong to China. And this happens to be the world's single most important body of water for world trade, passes through it. And so the Vietnamese, the other countries around
Malaysia, Philippines, and I just found the map here, and it's called the 9-dash map because there are 9 dashes that trace southward from China along the coast of Vietnam, down towards Singapore, turns right at east of Kuala Lumpur to Malaysia, and then back up north along the border of the Philippines. So it's a very large oceanic area that's covered by this, that the Chinese are saying, no, this is our playground. But it's not just about container ships, it's about LNG and crude oil as well.
And oil, because region. China imports 75% of its oil, and a large part of it passes through those waters. And the Chinese have been concerned about what I call in the new map, what the Chinese call the Malacca Dilemma. That is that the waters, the strait that leads past Singapore, that the US Navy could block it if there was a conflict over Taiwan. So the Chinese have really moved pretty aggressively to claim this as their waters. And they base it on what they say are historic claims, that this has been, 2,000 years, 1,500 years, that this belonged to China. The other countries, including the United States, say, wait, those claims don't hold up under the law of the sea. That's not the way that you adjudicate, claims, and that you can't claim these, and it gets into arcane issues of international law. But basically, there's no sign of compromise here, and it is, I quote James Stavridis, who used to be Admiral, Supreme Commander of NATO, but he had other commands as well, who said, this is the most dangerous point where the US Navy and the Chinese Navy could collide. And there have been several near misses there. And the big worry, the big concern, the big fear is that there sometime may not be a near miss. And what happens if there is some kind of collision or some kind of action that involves US and Chinese navies in that region? And given that the relationship between the US and China is becoming much more confrontational, how do you resolve it? So, we talked about things to keep your eye on. The Eastern Mediterranean's one. South China Sea is very important to keep a major eye on it.
And so this area being a potential flashpoint for what could be global conflict, not just bilateral conflict between the U.S. and China, but to me, it's interesting that you can trace that back to 1933 from this very map that you reproduced here.
Yeah, right. Well, he did a couple of them. The one, I think the 36 map, but he did a series of them, but that's the one that was key, and it was all a response to these 3 French ships going to these islands and saying these are ours, and here we are today.
Georges Meersemacher, was that
yes,
you
exactly.
Yeah, the great name.
We went into the French archives to try and find out a little more about him and what happened to him, but the archives were not well enough organized to help us. So we found some of the things about him and the ships, and how they, what the ritual was for doing this. But Robert,
it seems almost quaint, almost colonial, like 500 years ago with Columbus or something. They put up a flag and they kneel down and they say a prayer to the sun. Right, and that, it just seems, it's 100 years ago, so almost 100 years ago now.
Yes,
but even looking at it through that lens, it still seems really quaint that I hereby declare this an island for whoever.
And of course, that was the imperial, there was no independent Vietnam. The Philippines was an American colony. But there was real concern about, the French were really worried about expansionist Japanese, and one of the things that got them really concerned is that the Japanese had taken a position in a bat guano, bat guano on an island because you could use it for fertilizer, and they saw this as Japanese expansionism, and that was the era of Japanese expansionism, of course.
Huh. Well,
But,
you mentioned the archives, if I can interrupt. So what, you obviously did a lot of research in a lot of different places. What was there one point in the research on this? And by the way, this is the Power Hungry podcast. We're talking to Daniel Yergin about his new book, The New Map. Whoop, I took the book jacket off. There's the book jacket. The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Class of Nations. Was there one bit of research that in doing all this that you thought, oh, well, this is really cool, or one interview or one moment where you were doing this and I thought, where you say, okay, this is worth it. I've been slaving over this for all this time and this is a gem?
Well, I think that whole thing about the South China Sea, because I think that's a real eye opener. And even when I tell Chinese people about it, they're amazed. They don't know that history. So I thought that was great to do. I think I found on the shale revolution, I went to the first successful shale well in the United States, and
in Dish, Texas,
just a little wire enclosed thing, and you thought, here's some people who did something that everybody said wasn't going to work, and it worked, and look at the impact it's had. I think there were certain moments I describe in the book. One moment when Vladimir Putin started shouting at me, that was a memorable experience.
I don't recall that
part. Well, I didn't use the first person in the book.
Oh, okay.
But I describe an incident where someone, me, had the opportunity at this conference in St. Petersburg to ask him a question about the Russian dependence on hydrocarbons for its budget and so forth, and diversification. And by accident, I mentioned the word shale. And he erupted and started shouting at me about how dangerous shale was. And I really took away from that the Russians saw shale as a bolster and an adjunct to U.S. foreign policy because of the flexibility it gave the U.S. So I think insights.
And what year was that, Dan?
That would have been 2013, 2014, in that period.
So before the big volumes of oil and gas really started to roll, that Putin was understanding this is a threat.
Yeah, he was understanding at that point, the Poles were starting to look for shale in Poland, and the Russians were feeding information to environmental or quasi-environmental groups to create sort of environmental opposition to it. So Putin expressed great worry that the water to Warsaw would be poisoned by shale. And he really, he knew his brief. He knew what to say. But I think that, I think the whole, just to give another example, talking to the guy who's, one of the two or three great innovators of autonomous vehicles was really interesting. So I think, like probably you found too, you go down a lot of different paths, and if you like research, it's nice to have a nice big subject to research, and you just, at some point you have to say, I can't know everything. You have to stop at some point,
right?
But somebody once said to me, a publisher once said, you have to know everything, but your reader doesn't have to know everything. Because the other thing is you have to.
Well, you have to ring fence it. You have to ring fence it somewhere, which is, so now just another quick, just about the technical or the kind of the putting the book together. This is about 450 pages.
But wait, Robert. Oh. It's 450. That's right. Subtract the index, subtract the endnotes. That's right. And then we're down to 450. That's right. Thank you.
Just the text, right? But what I've written a couple books, a few books. I seem like I just have to write a certain length, right? I think, oh, well, I'll make this one shorter. I don't have to write this long. Is that what you found for this?
Well, I did. Well, the prize was, the longest of my books. And, but that was an era before email, before Twitter. And, people would spend time with it. I still see people write 900-page books, but I just wonder, particularly 900-page biography, I just wonder about
who has time to read it.
Unless it's a wonderful story. So the Quest was 200 pages shorter, and this is 200 pages shorter than the Quest. So, and I.
So the next one's going to be Cliff Notes then.
Cliff notes, right. But I have some great outtakes that I think I'm going to write some articles from that I just, I hate it. You probably know this as a writer. You found out something, or you thought of a way to address something. You just hate to not have it in there, but you have to say, I have to think about the reader.
Yeah. Right. And that was, I had the same experience in writing A Question of Power, parts of the research that I had done that I wish I had included in the book now in retrospect. But of course, that's let's move
Robert,
on.
One thing about, congratulations on The Question of Power. And I noticed, obviously there's been overlap in the themes that you and I have written about over the years, but I was really struck by your focus on electricity, as you put it, women in developing world, that, and your 3 billion people number, that don't have access to electricity, or they have less access than your refrigerators, I think you put it.
That's right.
Although I gather you have a great refrigerator.
But actually an average, bought it at Home Depot, but that about 1,000 kilowatt hours that's not unusual for an average. Well, efficiency's gotten better now, but yeah.
Exactly. But the reason I was struck, because that's one of the, I wanted to give people a wider perspective than what they may just get living in their own sector. And that what you point out, 3 billion, that number 3 billion people don't have access to clean energy for cooking. So it's the same thing you observed. They use wood, which has to be gathered, or animal dung, or crop waste. And the World Health Organization said the biggest environmental threat, in the world is indoor air pollution from cooking.
Yeah.
And for those people, like I've had the opportunity to work as an advisor to India on what it's doing on energy, and they want commercial energy. They want, in addition to electricity, they want to make oil, and they particularly want natural gas, clean natural gas or propane, to be able to get to villagers so that don't have indoor air pollution.
Right.
And so for them, commercial energy is a positive,
Well, it's absolutely particularly for women and girls, potentially a matter of life and death. I was struck by that point, and you made in that section on India, that now there are 80 million Indians who are using the government program for propane distribution, which
right.
I've only been to India once, but those canisters were ubiquitous. I mean, people carrying them on bicycles, on little motos, et cetera, because the only alternative was wood, dung, or there was no wood laying around in India because it was all being burned.
Right.
But let's go back to China, because I wanted this to keep the focus on the maps, and we could talk all day about this stuff. You and I both love it, but I want to go back to Bai Meichu, because the Bai Meichu, the national humiliation map, which still, and then you have a photo. I commend you too. The photos in the book are really good. I think you probably had a good photo archivist working with you, but
we worked, a great woman. I'd worked with her before, and worked with her really closely people would not believe how much work went into the photos and then to writing the captions. So I see the text, the photos, and the captions as kind of an integrated package.
Oh yeah. So just back to this issue of there's a great photo of Xi Jinping and some of the other Chinese leaders at the National Humiliation Museum. I think that's the
National Museum, but it's after Xi Jinping became party secretary, he led the other members of the Politburo right over to that museum, stood in front of the exhibit called The Century of Humiliation, and that theme of a century of humiliation, of European dominance of China, of keeping China down, keeping China fragmented, is central to the kind of political narrative of China and what it's doing in the world today and what its policies are. So it's just a constant refrain, and you realize this is very deep-seated.
And I didn't realize that either. And the fact that you have a cartographer with this national humiliation map going back to the 1930s, now 90 years, but that history is not old. In fact, it's not even, it's not even history. It's their identity about Chinese redeeming themselves in the modern world, or to get past this humiliation? Is that a proper way to characterize
Well,
it?
I think it is. It's, they, under the former Chinese president, they used to talk about peaceful rise. I think that language has kind of faded away, and China in the last decade has become, or the last 7 or 8 years, has become a more assertive player. I also write in the new map about the Belt and Road program, which is, estimates that the one I cite is $1.4 trillion investment program around the world to promote what they call connectivity, which would, really make China even more central in the world economy than it is today.
Well, and I noticed, I saw a snippet of the Secretary of State Pompeo the other day. I mean, some pretty bellicose language toward the Chinese. I mean, this seems like the ramping up of this kind of rhetoric is not very helpful.
Robert, I was just going to use that word, ramping up, in the last few months on all fronts, on territorial issues, on technology issues, human rights issues. It has gotten more and more tense. As I said, my first book was on the origins of the Cold War, and it just became clear as I was writing this that we're headed in that direction again. But it's going to be different than the Soviet-American Cold War, which was, a lot of it was based upon nuclear weapons. This is very different, and the Soviet Union was not a major factor in the global economy. China is a very major factor in the global economy, and in fact, as we've discovered, the US and the Chinese economies are much more interconnected than they are today. So as I've traveled around the world, I've found, many countries, they're saying we don't want to have to choose between the US and China. I did a dialogue with the president of Columbia, not the university, the country. And he said, our relationship with the United States is fundamental, but China's a really big customer of our economy. So I see that. And there was an article by the Prime Minister of Singapore that ran in Foreign Affairs this summer, the magazine Foreign Affairs, where his thing was too is don't make us choose. So, there's a lot at stake in the relationship, and trade and the economic side used to be a stabilizing factor, but it's become a
conflict, a point of conflict. Yeah. So let's just a couple of things about OPEC here, because this has been a source of great attention. Is OPEC is called a cartel, but does it really have power over the market now? You opened the book by talking about the big three: Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. Is OPEC really just Saudi Arabia now?
I think people still have the image of OPEC in their heads from the 70s and the 80s and maybe the 90s. The world's changed. I mean, this is part of the new map. It's changed. If you look at where world oil production, the major players, it's the big three. The United States is the world's #1 producer. To sort of say this other group of countries is the cartel, when they don't control that much of the market, is different. I mean, what you do, obviously, we did have, and I was able to write about it in the chapter called "The Plague," in the spring, in April of 2020, when, of all people, Donald Trump was a mediator between Russia and Saudi Arabia in stabilizing the oil market at a time when oil prices in some cases were actually negative. And that showed the shift that's gone on. So, so OPEC, I think, is a framework. It's become part of the dialogue around energy transition and so forth. But it's the nations, OPEC, Saudi Arabia is a member, but so is Iran, and they're, sworn enemies to each other.
Sure.
So I think it's more helpful to think about in terms of the big three and what each of them are going to do in terms of their energy policies.
Because their policies can then sway the markets in such a big way, and even just by talking about it. So, well, that leads into this discussion about shale, which to me it's been so disruptive. And you mentioned the Putin's unkind tone towards you in St. Petersburg. But it brings me back to OPEC, and in that earlier this year, I wrote a short piece just looking back at the Texas Railroad Commission back in the 1930s when they implemented pro-rationing. And at that point, it was earlier this year, I thought, well, maybe we need something new like that in the United States to restrain production in the United States. But the question is this: is what has been the fundamental recurring problem in the oil market globally? Has it been undersupply or oversupply?
Well, I think if you look at historically, thinking back to the 19th century even, you had periods of both, of undersupply and oversupply, of markets being tight and then markets being oversupplied. I mean, the beginning of the oil crises of the 70s, in the early 70s, market had become extraordinarily tight because demand was really strong and countries were switching from coal to oil for electricity generation. In New York City, Con Edison was switching to oil for environmental reasons. So the markets were really tight. And then other periods, you have, protracted periods of oversupply and pressure on price. So I think, one lesson is that, markets go in cycles, commodity markets go in cycles, and supply and demand, often there's a mismatch between the two.
So, but it seems to me that, some of these sanctions on Iran and now the sanctions that are in place against Venezuela, that they've in fact acted to reduce supply more than what, any kind of allowables under OPEC would do. But more recently, the market, is it fair to say that more recently, it's been the last 2 years or so, it's been the chronic problem has been oversupply, right?
Yeah, well, I think what you used the term before, Robert, disruptive technology, and that's what shale was. And so actually the oil price collapse started in 2014, 2015 because of there are many reasons: slowing down of demand, the end of a commodity boom in terms of consumption. But you had this sudden surge that had never happened before, this much oil coming into the market this quickly. And the market was oversupplied and it collapsed. Then you had the emergence of what was called OPEC Plus, which kind of was stabilizing the market, and economic growth and resolution of U.S.-Chinese trade tensions seemed to be pointing. And then you had this additional collapse and true oversupply because of the collapse in demand. But shale, I think shale is going to continue. It's going to continue, but I think there'll be a period of decline and then recovery again. And then it'll just become a more normal part of the market rather than this dynamic disruptor that it was in the recent previous years.
Sure. So, broader question about the oil sector. I just looked up these numbers. With recent Gallup poll found that only 39% of Americans approve of the oil and gas sector. It ranked 21st out of 25 sectors in favorability. A poll I saw several years ago showed the oil and gas sector ranking even below the federal government. Now, when people hate Congress more than they hate your industry, then that's a problem. Why is the oil and gas industry been so demonized over the years, and why does, or more fair question, why does the general public dislike the oil industry or tend to dislike it?
I think it starts with people. No price is more visible than the price of gasoline, and people, most people, 280 million cars in the United States, 279 million running gasoline. So people see that price, and when it goes up, they don't like it, right? And it does go up sometimes. And then I think there's this kind of historic mythology around oil companies as kind of great manipulators. In fact, what they are they're kind of high-tech companies, run by engineers and scientists. But it does, oil involves international politics. It involves countries around the world. So I think there are a whole host of factors that come into it. And yet, if you look at, let's say, during this COVID crisis, people working at home, and, the oil and gas industry, like the electric power industry, has to operate at a very high level of safety. And on a global basis, even with all this disruption, even with people getting sick and so forth, we didn't see any breakdown in the supply system. You didn't have any cases of ambulances or fire trucks that couldn't get fuel. So, I think kind of the reality is that this is, most people, if you talk to them who are senior people in the oil and gas industry, are engineers. They're not, wheeler dealers, but there's enough of that legend, and there's still, some of that, there have been some, shall we say, very colorful figures in this industry. And in some ways, I think it goes back to John D. Rockefeller and Ida Tarbell, who wrote the expose of Standard Oil at the beginning of the 20th century. And I think, all of those images have stuck. It's not, it's, what are industries that people like? Well, until recently, they really like tech. It seems to be that there's a more mixed feeling. So I think probably another time we can think about what are the most popular, what industries do people love the most? Maybe they love apps on their cell phone, or,
right?
Or they like their iPhone a lot.
Sure. So, well, you mentioned this. So you have several chapters in the book about electric vehicles. I didn't realize that half of all the world's EVs are sold now in China. And you have several chapters about automobiles and mobility. You talk about the rise of Uber. And you wrote that owning a car is less urgent than in the past in terms of staking out identity, status, and coming of age. It is no longer the emotional signifier of freedom and autonomy. What was your first car?
I didn't get my first car, I got my driver's license as soon as I could at 16. I didn't get a car probably till I was a graduate student. I was in school, but I do remember in high school, I didn't have a car, but a lot of the people who had cars were cool. I wasn't cool because I didn't have a car. One of my favorite statistics in this book, and part of it's in the prize, but in the 1950s, it was said that 40% of marriages were proposed in automobiles. Now it's said that 30% of marriages and long-term relationships result from meeting online. And I think that basically social media has brought this sense of freedom that owning an automobile used to have. That, still for many people it's significant, but it's not, it's not the sign of, growing up, getting independent of your folks. You
Sure.
can get independent of your parents much earlier online.
And so your first car was?
It was a used Volkswagen station wagon.
Uh-huh.
Very used, I have to say.
The old squareback station wagon, yeah. And what do you drive now?
I drive a Volvo.
No electric vehicle for you.
Not when it comes to technology, personally, I'm sort of not an early adapter. IHSMarkit, our company, just did this thing that the average US car stays on the road now 12 years. And I realized one of our cars is 9 years old and one is 10 years old. So, it's, the car, people hang on to their cars.
Yeah, mine are older than that.
They're older. What do you drive?
Well, we have 3 vehicles in our driveway, which we don't drive much.
Yes.
Staying at home pretty much all the time. But I have an old Toyota pickup, a 2006. I have a 2005 4Runner, and then a 2012 Acura TSX. So they're
all working fine.
They all work fine, and I drive them less now than before. But
Sure.
I like them, and I'm
So
not going to buy an EV.
You don't feel that you need to be cool and get a new car every year.
Well, I can't afford it, for one. And if I could have, I could afford it if I wanted to, but then I would just have a new car sitting in the driveway instead of
exactly.
such old cars.
Yeah.
So,
one of our cars that's 10 years old has 6,000 miles on it.
6,000 miles on a 10-year-old car?
Yeah. So
wow.
We don't, live in the city and just, do short drives, don't do that much. One of the things that we're looking at IHSMarkit is gasoline demand, which went down 50% in April in the US. And now it's kind of plateaued at around 17 or 18% because people aren't driving. And it raises the question, about commuting. Will people be driving to work every day or not? Many people won't now. They'll Zoom.
Well, and you bring up that was one of the questions I wanted to bring up, because what's interesting about your book and the way you shape it is that you say, okay, well, here's the case, and here's this history of electric vehicles, and here's how Volkswagen is saying they're going to roll out all these new vehicles. But then, and you talk about the new mobility revolution, and about how much the much discussed energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables. But then you say in the conclusion that that oil will maintain a preeminent position as a global commodity, still the primary fuel that makes the world go round. And that this is based on, quoting again, on the reality of all the investment already made, lead times for new investments, and investment in innovation, supply chains, its central role in transportation, the need for plastics, and you go on. So is it fair to say oil's here to stay?
Well, I think oil, I think it's now 32% of world energy. Its share of total world energy will decrease, but I think it will remain the preeminent commodity because of all the things that you've just cited from the new map in terms of, the automobile fleet. I mean, our estimate currently is that today there are 1.4 billion cars. By 2050, there'll be perhaps 2 billion, and 600 million of them will be electric, and 1.4 will still run on gasoline. So I think the energy transition is just, it's going to happen, but I think it's going to happen over a considerably longer period of time than some of the goals that have been set now suggest.
Well, let me follow up on that, because that was one of the questions right after that, which was that this idea about the Green New Deal has been very appealing, and there's a lot of talk about, we'll go to net zero by 2050. I just, looking at the BP numbers, like you, I like to, look at the statistics. I think the hydrocarbon share of global primary energy has fallen 3 percentage points in 3 decades.
Yeah, well, so, it's 84% of global demand.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like Europe has that goal of by 2050, net zero carbon. That really means rebuilding your economy. So people right now say, well, actually it'll be easier because low interest rates, governments can spend more money. The other hand, we've just seen that the US ratio of debt to GDP is now 100%. It's equivalent to World War II, and it will go higher than it was in World War II. So governments are going to be constrained in finance. And so, I think it won't be clear, that a lot of this will become clear, and I'll be looking sort of next spring, as presumably there's a vaccine in place and we started to see life really returning to normal, to see how these things are going to play out. So I think to make judgments now is premature while we're still in the midst of a crisis that has proved more protracted than had been expected.
Well, so just a few more things that I want to talk about, because that that Green New Deal, the appeal of renewables, why is that allure so strong? The hatred of the oil and gas industry is strong, and
Robert,
the allure of renewables is remarkably strong.
Great. You've just finished a great book on electricity. And you've spent 3 or 4 years looking at that. I'm going to ask you that question.
Well,
why, Robert?
I think there's a romanticism of the past. I think that's this idea, we can get everything we need here from above ground, right? And we can just harness the sun and the wind, and that those are more wholesome somehow than looking underground. It doesn't require mining. So I think it's a couple of things, right? This kind of return to the garden, I think, is part of it, right? That there's some religious connotation here about, if we only go, it's even in the beginning sentences in Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, right? At one time, man lived in harmony with nature, and there's somehow this identity about a belief that somehow we've been sinful, and that was one of the things that I thought was really interesting, because you talk about this too in the toward the end of the book. You talk about flight shaming. You said it's a big deal in China, but in Sweden rather, but China is building 8 new airports a year. So that was one of the questions I wrote down for you. Has the West gained the guilt complex over energy? This is what we hear from Greta Thunberg and so on.
It is. If you're a rich society, you can think in those terms, but I think if you're a developing country and you've been poor, India, China, many other countries, it's a different thing. I think that, there's no question. I talk about the shale revolution. There's been a solar revolution. Costs of solar and wind have come down. They're competitive. You have government policies supporting them. But I do say there that if we move more into that era, we're going to move into a new era of big shovels, because you're going to need a lot of mining. And I think one of the things that I'm researching now are the supply chains for a net zero carbon future. I mean, what do you need in terms of raw materials? These, and if you look at an electric car, it has a lot of plastic in it. Where does plastic come from? Oil and gas.
Sure.
So, I think I think your comment is very interesting describing it. And I think there's a need to look at this holistically. Wind and solar will certainly be a bigger part, as you know, and electricity, but I think the energy system is basically going to be a mixed system. And, there are other things that will be important, like carbon capture and so forth of it.
So we talked a lot about pipelines crossing international borders, but there's something that you don't really discuss in your book, but I'm just curious to get your views on it, because I've looked at the IEA statistics on this. They're compared to oil and gas trade, and the cross-border trade in electricity is really very small. Europe has an interconnection. We have interconnections in the U.S. with Canada and Mexico. Why isn't much electricity traded across borders? Why don't we have lots of high voltage transmission lines moving across borders?
Well, I think there's controversy about them. There's been efforts to bring high voltage. You probably know the details, from Canada into the United States and so forth. There's opposition to energy infrastructure. I think also countries, you've written about the centrality, the ever-growing centrality of electricity, and countries worry about dependence. So I think that's part of it too. And it has to do with, how you're generating your electricity and where. But electricity, one of the takeaways from your book is electricity is a matter of national security and economic security.
So you talk about, in the end, right in fact, it's one of the closing lines in your book about a fragmenting global order. Is the U.S. in decline? And what are the countries that you think are going to be the ones that emerge from this in a stronger position?
Well, I think one of the things as I was writing the book that really hit me is how important the 2008, 2009 economic crisis was, because that was the moment when the U.S. model for economies was suddenly called into question, because that crisis started in the heart of the U.S. economy. And China was the first country to actually come out of that crisis. And Chinese, if you look at Chinese sources, they really see that as a major turning point. So I think it's to some degree discredited, U.S. leadership. Obviously, right now our relations with our allies are pretty fractious, and yet those alliance systems are very important and a source of strength for the United States. But I think, on the other hand, what the U.S. has gained from is, technology, or technology leadership. But you certainly see China challenging that, and a kind of a fragmenting of the supply chains that both China and the United States have depended upon. So,
Sure.
Maybe things will look different a year from right now. But I think, the U.S. is clearly in a more powerful position because of its energy position, the flexibility it has in foreign policy, and so forth. So, in some, but I think we've lost influence in trade. And to go back, I think the relationship with Europe, Japan, these countries is a source of strength for the United States.
So last two things. Thank you. Who are the energy analysts or publications you follow? I know you've got a big organization, so you follow a lot of your own. I guess another way about who are you reading? Who do you follow?
Well, I guess I don't follow specific people. I follow sources. So it's quite a wide range, both public and private sources, journalism. I read Oil Daily every day, International Oil Daily. I love the monthly energy review from the Department of Energy. So, kind of a host of sources.
Sure.
And of course we have, IHSMarkit, we probably have 800 energy researchers. So I'm certainly following what they're doing.
Sure. So last question then, Dan, and again, talking to Daniel Yergin about his new book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. What gives you hope?
I think, I'm an optimist by nature. I think that what gives me hope is actually looking at what technology has done over the last couple hundred years, and that there's no, it's hardly at an end, that we will find, I think, to address the issues that are ahead and climate and all these other issues depends upon technologies that haven't yet been developed or deployed. So I think that's it. And, and that rationality will prevail.
Well, that's a good place to stop. So thanks to all of you for tuning into this edition of the Power Hungry podcast. My guest has been Daniel Yergin. His book, The New Map, it's available on all of the outlets, I'm sure, all over the world or all over the country. You can find it at your local bookstore. Daniel, thank you very much for being with us, and hope we can talk another day.
Right.
And
well, Robert,
to all of you out there in podcast land, tune in. If you like this one, go to ratethispodcast.com/powerhungry and give us one of those fancy ratings on that thing. So again,
Robert,
go ahead.
Maybe what do you want to do? Because I want to just say, let me say something, and then you could maybe
of course.
Okay. Robert, thank you very much for having me on Power Hungry. I have great respect and admiration for what you've been writing about energy, including your new book on the question of power. So very much appreciate this opportunity to sit down with you and talk about the new map and the new world of energy. Thank you.
Well, that's very kind. Thanks. Okay. Well, thanks again to all of you out there. Tune in next time for the next edition of the Power Hungry podcast.